that picture you found with the like the assimilation ceremony where they
Yeah, so this is, this kind of goes back to allotment policy. There was it's kind of a little bit tangential, but I think it's also important. It plays into this whole idea of like civilization and an approximation to what a lot of these Indian agents saw as whiteness, and they would say this in their reports. So parents, during allotment, a family or a head of household was allotted about 160 acres of land, depending on where, and then surplus land was sold off, often to whites. I think there was like 90 million acres. That was essentially like considered quote unquote surplus land that was sold off. Um, and they would have these competency commissions that would go around for allottees, people who are allotted, their land, to work as farmers, basically, or to develop the land and to such a degree that they could live off of it sustainably. And it's like most families who are allotted land, or most individuals who are allotted land, often never went to that land because it was literally just scribbled on a piece of paper. And then, like much like our Indian money accounts, I can't go to the government and be like, I want to cash out my individual Indian money account, write me a check. They'd probably be like, oh, we don't know where it's at, where's the money? um and behind the scenes there's like an Oz figure just like printing out $100 Benjamins, anyways, because it's all fake. But these competency commissions were set up to like prove that through agriculture, through working the land, through managing cattle or whatever it was that somebody was doing with their land, that these indigenous people most often were considered quote unquote full bloods, those who couldn't speak English very well or didn't speak English at all, and often were considered like almost unassimilatable or unable to assimilate. They were considered ineligible for citizenship or ineligible to own land in private. And that's important to note, that most, even today, competency commissions, or competency tests still exist. They never went away. It's just practiced with less frequency, and it's practiced for other reasons that I don't have time to get into. But for the sake of putting one's land from a trust relation, or from trust into private ownership, one had to prove themselves capable of, not only speaking and understanding English, but also being a proper American citizen and taking an oath and waving a flag. And so they had these competency. I think it was McLaughlin, who was the former superintendent at Standing Rock Agency and also played a hand in assassinating Sitting Bull. In the 1910s, he set up these competency commissions, which had this whole ceremony. And he was down in Yankton, in the Yankton Reservation, and he was handing, basically, the competency ceremony was this: the freed Indian who became a citizen of the United States was in a teepee, stepped out of the teepee, shot an arrow, like as if like I'm gonna, I'm foregoing my ancestral and primitive ways, and then grabbed a plow and got a flag. So it was like a very kind of symbolic act. But this idea of competency like worked in different ways because, quote unquote mixed bloods, those who were more approximated to whiteness, were often granted competency or fee simple or access to privatize their land more so than people who were considered full blood or those who were considered traditional or backwards, right? And that's an important distinction for a variety of reasons. But it's also part of another tactic of just getting people to relinquish their land. Because in other instances, when people were considered incompetent, in the case of a lot of indigenous people in Oklahoma, there was an active oil boom, going on, and those who were considered incompetent couldn't manage their own affairs and were put into a conservatorship, much in the same way that Britney Spears was put into a conservatorship by her father. Granted a power of attorney by the court to basically manage the affairs, the business affairs. And this happened to like thousands or hundreds of indigenous people and landowners. They were declared incompetent by the courts, and then it was a whole scheme. Like the lawyers, it's the premise of that book, Flowers, Killers of the Flower Moon. about the Osage oil murders, but it was ongoing, for quite some time. And so competency, played a huge role. And if one had attended boarding school, one was more likely to be deemed competent as well. And I saw some of that in the files. Like they may have been full blood, considered full blood, but nonetheless they spoke English and they flew the American flag or whatever it was, and then they could sell their land. And most often, the people who were deemed competent often just sold their land because they needed it for money for survival, and so they sold it to white people, and that's where you get fractionation on reservation land. So allotment opened surplus land for whites, and then in the course of competency, quote unquote, or citizenship, it allowed native people to sell their land to white people on one hand, or if they were deemed incompetent and then put into a conservatorship, it allowed white people to come in and steal the resources that way. And so this is that whole kind of back and forth. And just to go back to Indian child removal. And I think this is one of the sections of the report itself. And after 1871, Congress enacted a series of laws to basically order Indian parents to send their children to school, and to authorize the Secretary of Interior to issue regulations to quote unquote secure the enrollment and regular attendance of eligible Indian children who are wards of the government in schools maintained for their benefit by the United States or in public schools. So this, as you pointed out, Jen, kind of basically, coerced families into sending their children to these schools. And this happened in many ways, in a variety of ways, often through coercion or force. And I read some reports where Indian police or Indian agents were actually going out and saying, you will get money if you send your children to school. And in the case of I think, if we think about how, we have today we have what is called the poverty draft, where we have an entirely volunteer run military, but a lot of people join because of economic situations. And a lot of the churches who were getting federal money, or Johnson O'Malley money later on, as it was called, had parents who volunteered their children. They voluntarily gave up their children to the church, basically, to go to these schools. I would say my family included. Many of my aunts and uncles went to these schools, but I think maybe my grandparents had an idea of Christian education or whatever, but really they were just poor and they couldn't take care of them. So is that really voluntary? Is that voluntary? Is that the voluntary giving up of children? I don't think so. I think it's creating economic and social conditions where that becomes the only option. And that too in itself should be considered a form of child removal. That parents are put into this situation where they can't even take care of their own children, and the resources that they should be receiving for those children are instead going to church groups or going to boarding schools, where their children will face high rates of sexual abuse and violence. And that was something that was also fascinating about the research that we've been doing at the National Archives here, is that there are many instances of complaints and investigations of sexual abuse against of Native children in these things. It wasn't really covered up, and it makes me wonder. We see the official record of it, right? And the allegations that existed and the investigations. Many of them were found, not liable in these cases, or were proven not guilty because their accusers were children, right? They were minors. They were wards of the government. They didn't have any power, any standing. But how many, didn't come forward? How many do we not know about? And the prevalence of these kind of these instances of sexual abuse, and in many ways, a lot of, especially we know about the Catholic Church, clergy, and the prevalence of sexual abuse in the clergy in other places, especially when it happens to white people. But there's been an active kind of attempt to erase that and how it's happened to Native people at these schools specifically, and not just at Catholic, or faith-based schools, but also at regular, boarding schools, federally run boarding schools. And whatever people say, it's not just about there's not a clean kind of dichotomy, or it's not black and white. It's like, not to say that like the federal schools were somehow secular and the faith-based schools weren't, because the federal schools actually required and had circulars that required children to, or were they, they compelled children to attend mass a certain amount of times, or compelled them to learn the Lord's Prayer and to read a certain Bible, right? So they were taking federal money and basically, you know, inculcating Christianity or Christianizing Native children from the federal side. Yeah, I don't know if you want to say anything about that particular thing, because I think it's prevalent in this report, but it's also a little bit murky, because there were, in the, and we'll talk about this in the wrap up and the analysis, but there was a large investigation of a lot of these Catholic schools in Canada, and that were taking First Nations children's, and the abuse that happened, and there was a class action lawsuit that resulted from it. And there's a demand for an apology from the Pope, and I think he did apologize. I read the thing and it didn't really seem like an apology to me, but I don't know. Nobody says, sorry. But that instance was interesting, because while we have access to the records, the federal records, and there's this report, it makes me wonder how the federal government is going to respond to the church, which seals its records, and it seals the records of a lot of its priests, especially those who have been credibly accused. It's hard to get. They don't open the file until 50 years after the priest's death, right? And there are special rules that kind of like, even though they might have accepted like Johnson O'Malley money, which came out of the Indian Reorganization Act and therefore is federal money, they accept it for the care of children, but not necessarily the education of those children. So they excuse themselves from like, oh, well, we're not like subject to certain federal laws. And I think that's going to be an issue that I want to see, play out in this, is like, how is the Department of Interior going to respond to this? Because the Catholic Church isn't forthcoming about its records, and I don't think it will be, especially in the wake of all this.